Welcome. I'm Mary Weil at the Ivey Business School, talking to Cheryl Kim. Cheryl Kim is a former reporter and now advises on CEO reputation and specifically CEO activism to CEOs and executives. So Cheryl, as we begin this conversation, what does CEO activism mean to you?
So first, thanks for having me, everyone. And hi, all you students that are sitting at home, certainly in your PJs. Mary and I got dressed for the occasion, but CEO activism, I think it's a good place to start, really, because the definition of that, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think if we level set a little bit, it'll be helpful for our conversation today. To me, CEO activism is something that, first off, comes from the CEO himself. It's not a corporate strategy. It's not super planned out in terms of how it's going to help the company in terms of their reputation, is be one thing. Two, it's really about getting involved in things that at the social or political level for your country or for the world. So it's over and above anything that's directly related to your company's well-being and industry, for example. And the third thing I think that's really important to really call it social CEO activism is that it involves a bit of personal risk. It involves getting involved in an issue that's controversial. And that they are actually, the CEO is speaking up because they are trying to achieve some sort of ends. They're trying to sway people's opinions in one way or another. They're trying to sway policy one way or another. They're trying to get people to do something that's different than what's happening today. And so those to me are the key components of CEO activism, which compared with CEO responsibility or CSR, for example, more broadly, can be involved in lots of things that are, social, that contribute to the social good, but aren't necessarily controversial, can be part of the corporate strategy. And, there's often an alignment between the company's strategy and the CEO's contribution to that.
That's a great start. The students have put together some really good questions, and I think that what you've outlined so far is going to lead nicely into the questions that they have. So let's take a look at some of their questions.
Mm-hmm. And the questions, guys, that you submitted were like really, really good. Like I was super impressed with the quality of the questions.
So how does senior leadership go about managing the interests of its shareholders while simultaneously trying to contribute to social causes that may interfere with the views of the shareholders or the board?
So I think first off, important to understand the difference between CEO activism and CEO responsibility and CSR here. I think the key here is that two things. One is that, people who are acting as CEOs in an activist kind of way, they're not really trying to conform to their shareholders' interests. They're not really trying to align with the board. A lot of these people, they're acting because, frankly, they just can't take it anymore. So I'll give you two examples. One, if you look at Tom's Shoes, right, which is run by was run by a guy named Blake Makowski. He started the company. A couple of years ago, there was a mass shooting near his home in California, and his wife called him one day at work, and she didn't want to take her kid to school because she was afraid, right? She'd been so affected by the shooting near their home that she became afraid, and she was crying on the phone. And it was at that point where he decided that he really needed to do something. And Tom's Shoes, was built on this premise of the 1-for-1 shoe, that every shoe the company sold, they would give away a pair of shoes to somebody in need. So the whole company was built around this idea of social purpose. But what he did was he said, okay, we're going to use the platform that I have, the platform that my company has, to advocate for gun control. Was that a, long thought out strategy? Did he consult all of his shareholders? No, but he did actually check in with a major debt holder, which was a hedge fund. And he did actually pull his employees on board. In that case, yes, he was advocating for change, but it came from something visceral within him. But he aligned it with a brand strategy, was to get the brand, was a statement about where the brand was. So they weren't necessarily separate things. Contrast that with an example of what another CEO did during a period last year when states in the US were really infringing and curtailing access to abortion, especially in the South. And the CEO of a company called Seek an Arrangement, which was, it's actually like the sugar daddy company. So, take that for what it's worth. But he was personally, when he understood how these laws were affecting women and their access to abortion, said, I'm going to pay for women who need to travel out of state to get abortions. I'm going to pay for them to do that. And that was him taking a stand personally on something that he believed was really important, that really did not do anything for his company. The things that these people have in common, though, is that they are majority shareholders of their company, right? They have control. And so the risks that they may be taking with their company are very much their personal risks also. You won't see a lot of these kinds of things happening with the big banks, for example, or the telcos in Canada, because they don't have that leeway to act so unilaterally. And so the CEO activism, what I consider true CEO activism, is actually very much narrowed to certain types of companies where the CEOs have majority control, or they're the founder, or the company is just so successful and the CEOs are so successful that if it all goes sideways, the CEO, in the end of it, he's going to be fine. If he loses his job, he can manage with that. And so I think that's the nuance there about kind of who can take these kinds of leaps.
And so what I'm hearing as well is there's a sense that as a CEO, the person, the executive, she might have some skin in the game. So when you're thinking about how you're conceptualizing it, there's an upside, but there's also a risk.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all of the true examples of CEO activism that you've seen over the last few years, the CEOs have taken both a personal risk and a risk with their company. Now, in many cases, it's a calculated risk. They've made decisions about, the impact of doing the right thing in their mind versus the impact of doing nothing. And they've decided that that's an acceptable risk. But to me, if it's not including some sort of risk, it's not really CEO activism, and that's a slightly different conversation.
So how do you think the size of a corporation affects the CEO's duty to support efforts specifically right now to slow the spread of COVID-19? In other words, should smaller corporations with fewer resources be able to opt out of helping the cause financially? Should every CEO have equal responsibility in the way they react and assist in this pandemic?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I wrote a piece last week, which I know you guys have read, about CEOs, and they were CEOs of big companies who were calling for companies to, adhere to the government guidelines on social distancing and allowing people to work from home and so forth. And I was really, unexcited by their statement. I think that, every company has a different situation in terms of the financial stability of the company, in terms of the customers at risk, whether they're going to lose contracts, whether they're going to be able to keep their employees on the payroll, whether they can keep their doors open and whether they can pay the rent and so forth. So every company has a different financial situation, and certainly each of them, has a difficult decision to make about what they can do for the greater good in these types of times, or whether it's really just about seeing and taking care of their customers, their employees. I do think that the bigger companies, almost by definition, have more of an opportunity to think about not just their direct stakeholders, but, the country at large and what they can do to contribute to that, right? And so, in fairness, the bigger companies did start to take actions over the last, week. In terms of what they could do for the greater good of the communities, but even small companies. I mean, there's some great examples of smaller companies who have looked for efforts where they could help out their community. And that even is, can they continue to pay their employees that are not working? Can they make sure that they pay their bills so that their vendors, are as stable as possible? And so it's fair ball that we ask the bigger companies, the more financially stable companies to do more. I do think that every CEO in this sort of situation does have to draw the line on the standards and the philosophy in which they have and how they treat people. And I think that, small companies are not absolved from taking good care of their employees, thinking about their customers, and, what they can do in these sorts of situations.
Absolutely. Some view CEO activism as a positive thing. But the question here is, do you think it's placing too much power in the hands of large corporations that already have a lot of influence in the political system?
Yeah, so Rachel, that's a great question. I think there's two parts to that in terms of where my mind goes. One is that, with respect to CEO activism, and I've been working on a book on this for a while, and this is one of the questions that I've grappled with, because I know I'll get a lot of backlash against my idea that CEOs should be speaking out more and trying to, contribute to public policy, for example. But it goes back to this, which is that, CEOs have always been involved in the political policy discussions and social policy discussions. They've just been doing it behind the scenes, right? So all of the lobbyists that are employed today, they are voicing the views of the CEOs, and they're being done at dinners and, private conferences and private phone calls that the public is not familiar with. And, in a lot of respects, what I'm saying is some of those conversations really need to come out in the public. They need to come out in the public for two reasons. One, so that, companies who do not have lobbyists and are not on the inside track can also participate in that conversation, but also so that you can get a richer discussion between customers, the public, and business and government and not-for-profits all out in the open. So to me, that's one part of it. The other thing I would say is that, in a lot of cases, the CEOs that are speaking up right now, they're doing so because they think the government has actually failed them, and not just failed companies, but failed the public. So it's not, to me, a surprise or a coincidence that the rise of CEO activism has happened at the same time as the rise and the power of Trump. Right? So if you think about the places where CEOs have really gotten involved in the US in the last few years, things around reproductive rights, around rights for transgender folks, around immigration. I mean, these are all issues where the public feels like the government is not acting ethically and morally, and where a lot of people feel quite disenfranchised because the political system has become so polarized that there's nothing down the middle for the majority, in my mind. So you're right to be concerned that CEOs have too much power. But I think that by bringing a lot of these conversations out into the public versus behind the scenes where they've always been happening, there is, to me, a bit of, democratization in there. And I'm not saying that CEOs, their views necessarily should be accepted, but that they need to be part of the public discourse.
Often, this question's from Janani. She says she sees companies pushing forward with corporate social responsibility initiatives with the CEO as their spokesperson. And she finds herself conflicted between believing that these companies and CEOs are pursuing these initiatives because they're being genuine, or simply because it will generate good publicity for the company. So her question is, how do you suggest we as consumers tell the difference between publicity stunts and genuine CEO activism?
Right. So to me, there's actually two parts in that question, Janani. And let me start with the last part first, which is genuine CEO activism. If it's, by my definition of CEO activism, if it's genuine, it's not going to feel like publicity, right? In the sense that it's not going to look like it's a publicity stunt for the benefit of the company. Because to me, true CEO activism, it's CEOs wading into these conversations that are by definition controversial. And in doing so, they're almost by definition going to lose some customers out of this. In my mind, when CEOs wade into these kinds of conversations, for example, reproductive rights or immigration or, those sorts of things, you're going to get some people who are going to support that CEO, and you're going to get some people who are like, I'm never doing business with them again. And, for the CEO, they have to decide whether the increased loyalty they'll look out for some is going to make up for the lost customers they're going to get on the other hand. To me, that's different from, CSR and social purpose. And there I would say that in many respects, those activities can do both, right? And still be genuine. So, I do some work with a company called Public Inc., which is an agency that's designed to help companies figure out what their social purpose is and how they can have what they call profit with purpose, meaning you can do good in the world, but still make money at it. And that those things don't have to be antithetical. So, going back to the example that a lot of you will be familiar with in Tom's Shoes, their whole thing is built around this idea of social purpose. I'm going to give away a pair of shoes for every pair of shoes that you buy. And, building in that idea of social purpose, you guys may be familiar with B Corp. Have you talked about B Corps, Mary, at all?
A little bit, yeah.
Right. So there's companies that have kind of made a pledge to, the ethics and moralities and, sustainability in which they'll talk, in which they'll act. To me, those ideas of social purpose, they can be used in branding and their publicity without, to me, being disingenuous. Because I think a lot of people today, especially in your generation, as you graduate from school, are starting businesses with that idea that you can have a business, be profitable, but still do good. And to me, I have no problem with those two things working together.
And that leads nicely into our next question, because you talked about CEOs and risk. And in the CBC's Cost of Living podcast, you were interviewed. You mentioned that Michael McCain recognized that the Maple Leaf Foods account was a platform he could use to reach his audience, and that he likely felt speaking out was a moral thing to do.
Yeah.
Do you believe that CEOs should first vet such acts of activism through their fellow C-suite executives, or does doing so taint that authenticity piece of what the CEO is feeling?
Yeah, so I think I stuck on, when I read this question, on the word vet, because I think there's a couple of situations there. So one, I would say that, CEOs do need to stay in touch with the executives they work with. At minimum, they need to tell them what they're doing, because, there is going to be implications for the people around them when they speak out, right? So it affects the comms teams, it affects, the CFO and the investor relations teams, it affects the salespeople who are dealing with their customers, it affects, if in some cases the retail people who are dealing with customers in the store and they need to know what to say to those kinds of things. So you do have an obligation as a CEO to make sure that the company, not just the executive team, but the broader company, understands where you're coming from and has at least a bit of a heads up as to like, hey, you may get questions about this, but here's what I'm doing. I don't think that lessens the authenticity of what you're saying. I think it does force you in doing so to just do a little bit of a gut check, meaning, everybody's been told, I'm sure at this point, don't press send on the email when you're mad. And this is kind of that at a little bit larger scale, right? Which is, if you really need to speak up about an issue, you do have the opportunity, and you should take the opportunity to just give a one Mississippi and talk to some people that you trust within the company to say, like, am I self-defeating here? Is this going to actually help the cause? And if so, is that worth the risk and the implications for the company? I don't think that lessens the authenticity of it. I do think that it's, frankly, as a CEO, it's your obligation.
And with any communication, with this kind of communication, with a new product launch, with a change in direction, having a plan, I think typically makes a communication go better.
Yeah. But let me come back to the Maple Leaf case in particular here, right? Like, I think that the thing to me that was so interesting about Maple Leaf is that it wasn't CEO activism. This was just a guy who was mad, saying, I'm really upset about what's happened. This has touched our family at Maple Leaf, and I want to speak up about it. And I think that people got really worked up about it because CEOs don't speak up about anything at all. Mm. But, the risk that he took, in my mind, was actually very very low. I mean, I would challenge anybody in your class to say, I'm no longer, buying bacon a month later because of what Michael McCain said about an air, like why, what did he say again? Like, does anybody remember? Like, especially, when we were in this situation now of a pandemic. I mean, it's moot. It's entirely moot what Michael McCain said on his company's Twitter feed 2 months ago. So I think people need to bear in mind that also the collective memory out there is pretty short.
It tends to gravitate quickly,
yeah,
be explosive, and then move on very quickly as well.
Very true.
In your LinkedIn post, you comment on how CEOs' response to the COVID-19 crisis has been underwhelming. During this unprecedented time of uncertainty and fear, isn't it difficult for CEOs to make groundbreaking decisions, though, when they are still trying to figure out how to navigate dealing with this issue?
Yeah. Tyler, your question kind of made me stop and pause. And, when I wrote that piece on I think it was Monday, I was perhaps a little unfair to your point that they were still trying to figure out what was up. And they spoke early with what was the obvious thing to say, which was everybody just please follow the government's guidance on what we should be doing around, work from home and social distancing and, taking care of your employees. I was really happy to see that in the subsequent days, both the banks and the telcos did make kind of company specific actions that I thought were really important, right? So you saw the banks kind of take some action on, mortgages and loans and so forth. You saw the telcos lift the limits on data and long distance and make it easier for people to use their phones and so forth when they're working from home. So they did take some actions that were quite specific that they could do to help the community in the coming days. And to your point, it probably took some days to figure out, okay, what was helpful? What can we afford to do? What are the implications? For example, if we lift data limits, will the systems be able to manage all that traffic? And it is hard. And then when you get, as companies get smaller and smaller, the number of people who can help make those decisions obviously gets smaller also. So sure, I do think that, smaller companies in particular have a harder time figuring this out because they're literally trying to figure out whether they've got enough money to keep the lights on. On the other hand, I would say that times of crisis are actually when we need CEOs to actually speak up the most and lead by example. I don't think that they get a free pass for treating employees badly. I don't think they get a free pass for being punitive in, how they treat their customers. And so there's a balance in there about, what you can do and can't do. But I do think, this is when our expectations of our leaders should be highest.
So I really appreciate the time that you spent with us today. I have one further question, something that we've been grappling with as a class as we go through this course, which is called Reputation Management, is does reputation really matter? So at the end of the day, for companies, we see crises, we see recoveries, we see really good communications and also some really bad communications. Does it matter?
I think it matters entirely, right? So let's think about companies that may be in financial difficulty right now. So if you're in a company that's in financial difficulty and you've got a bad reputation, your customer, suppliers, employees are less likely to help you out, to be patient, to give you a line of credit, to give you an extension, any of those things, anything when you now need something. If your reputation is poor and you haven't invested in that reputation, now is the time where it's going to come back to smack you, right? And you're going to see that all the way up and down the scale. So, where you see the airlines in trouble right now, right? And they leave customers stranded, or they go the extra mile to get customers home. Those things are going to come back to bite them because they've had to lay employees off. They're at some point, they're going to run into financial difficulties and they're going to ask the government to bail them out. And the government is going to have to make a decision based on how's the public going to react if we now bail out an airline, for example, that left all its employees stranded or all its customers stranded in overseas places. So reputation absolutely matters. And I should also say that, people should also remember that poor behavior is remembered forever. Good behavior is remembered for about 5 minutes. So let's take, for example, Galen Weston's note. So if you're a member of, Galen Weston is the owner of Loblaws, and he sent a note out to all PC Optimum loyalty membership cardholders recently, and it basically said, we know that you guys are worried. So we know you're worried about the stores shutting down. We're not going to do that. We know you're worried about price gouging. We're not going to do that. We know you're worried about, you know, and he just went on. And it was honestly one of the best CEO letters I've seen throughout this. It was assured, it was well written, it was, you know, hit the issues right on the head. Like a great, great example of CEO communications. In LinkedIn, all of the responses were, this is great communication. We really respect what he did here, blah, blah, blah. On Twitter, he got, yeah, but remember the price fixing you did on the bread?
Uh-huh.
Right? And oh, you're making your employees work, and you don't pay anything more than a minimum wage. And so, you know, that is where even when you do the right thing, something that you did poorly in the past, I mean, people don't forget, right? So I think that's one of the messages we should all take away is, you know, when we think about communications, is that, you know, the bad lives on much, much longer than the good.
It's a fair point. Thanks so much for your time today, Cheryl.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I hope you're all safe and well and learning lots.
They are still learning lots. Thanks.